Everybody, welcome back to PMP. We're live at the Ottawa courthouse today, where the trial of Mike Duffy has been the backdrop of a federal election campaign. That's the big difference in the way this trial started up again today. For political junkies, it's a political storm, the perfect storm, really. And the legal process is now colliding with the political process. And we want to dig into some of those legal questions, like, for instance, did Wright's testimony today support the charges against Duffy? Did it help the Crown's case? Does Wright's payment of Duffy's expenses shut down a political problem, or does it meet the bar of criminal intent? Let's dig into this now with a couple of lawyers who are live with me here at the courthouse. Rob Walsh, familiar to viewers and the former law clerk for the House of Commons, and criminal lawyer Jason Gilbert. Good to see you both. Thanks for being here. Hope you can help me sort things out, because I was in there and I listened closely, but I'm never sure where we've ended up at the end of the day. Rob Walsh, I'll start with you. What did you make of Wright's testimony, and do you think that it helped the Crown's case?
I didn't find anything surprising in Mr. Wright's testimony. I think much of it we'd already heard before. Sure. Admittedly, the explanation for the good-to-go email was anticipated. I mean, that was important, but it didn't amount to much. I don't think the Crown's case was advanced by Mr. Wright's testimony.
Why not?
I don't think he said anything that established any criminal intent on the part of Mr. Duffy with respect to the $90,000 transaction. I just don't see those charges in respect of that transaction, in the end of the day, being successful.
The bribery charge you're talking
bribery,
specifically.
Fraud on the government, breach of trust. The $90,000 transaction was not a criminal transaction. It was a political deal. Unworthy in the minds of many, perhaps. Political skullduggery of one kind or another. But in my view, it was not criminal in nature.
Well, I'm sure that's what we'll hear from Don Bain when he gets up there. Jason, what did you make of where things stand now for the Crown?
Well, I agree with Rob, certainly in his characterization of Nigel Wright's testimony. I think, if anything, it assists the defense. And so he's a bit of a trap witness in that respect for the Crown. Because on the one hand, the Crown has no choice but to call him, because he establishes that the payment was made.
Happened,
but the defense isn't contesting that anyway. Where his evidence actually assists the defense, in my opinion, is the more innocent Wright portrays his whole role in this. And the more innocent he characterizes the movement of the money from him to Duffy, the more innocent the acceptance of that money, and just makes it appear like a gift or a donation from a guy who could afford it to a guy who needed it.
Although, to be fair, the Crown did outline the various things that Duffy and his lawyer, or via his lawyer, were trying to pressure Wright and others to give him, whether it be the Deloitte audit, stopping that from going ahead or halting it. You know, there just seemed to be more and more conditions piling on. Was that not part of the Crown's attempt to try and say he was in it for something, that he was trying to get something out of it?
I think he was in it, Mr. Duffy, to protect his own political brand, and Mr. Wright was in it to protect the Prime Minister's political brand. They were out to advance their own political interests, respectively. And Ms. Payne, acting for Mr. Duffy, was assisting him in seeing that the outcome does that, as Mr. Wright, with people in the PMO, were trying to do what they could to see that the Prime Minister's position was assisted. I question myself, frankly, whether calling Mr. Wright as a witness isn't something of a gift to Mr. Bain on behalf of Mr. Duffy. I think I saw Mr. Bain leave here today at the end of the day with a big smile on his face. I think he's looking a gift horse in the house. I think he's going to have a great time with Mr. Wright tomorrow, whenever he gets to his cross-examination. And I think you'll find that much of the Crown's case will just not prove to have much substance.
I agree. I think that Wright is going to prove to be a friendly witness to the defense. And as you probably know, in cross-examination, a lawyer can more or less answer the questions for the witness. They could say, well, isn't it true that X? And, you know, wouldn't you agree with me that Y? And so Bain can pretty much encapsulate the answers that he wants to get out of Wright. And Wright is probably going to very easily agree with most of that, because to disagree makes his whole role in this maybe appear more nefarious than obviously.
He's happy to make it about politics, because that's what for him it was. Let's just break down, if we can quickly, the question that everybody still asks is why one half of the bribery scheme was charged and not the other. Do we have any clarity or ideas around that, Jason? And then
I can say this. Anytime two people or more, a group of people, could potentially be charged with a crime, it doesn't mean that you can't only charge one or two and then call the others as witnesses to prove the crime against the guy you really want to get. So I know that there's this big sort of principled thing that people are wondering about, well, how could they not have charged Wright but then charged Duffy? And the answer to that is, even if Wright did do something untoward, and even if the defense is able to establish that, and he wasn't charged, it doesn't mean that Duffy didn't do something wrong.
Yeah, and the critical word here, Jason, of course, is corruptly.
Yes.
So the question is, did Mr. Wright act corruptly in his end of the deal, or did Mr. Wright and Mr. Duffy? And I think the police came to the conclusion that they had evidence of a corrupt intention on Mr. Duffy's part, but they did not have evidence of a corrupt intention on Mr. Wright's end, and so there wasn't a basis for a charge against
because
Mr.
he
Wright.
wasn't getting something out of it, because it was his own money, all those kind of factors.
And if you look at the wording, and I'm not sure if Rob's going to agree with me on this, but if you look at the wording of Section 119, the bribery section, anyone who accepts, so even Duffy as the person accepting this amount of money, even if Wright is able to convince everybody that his intentions were entirely innocent, he was being Santa Claus and giving Duffy a Christmas present, if Duffy knew that in accepting that he was doing something wrong in the course of his parliamentary business, obviously that's going to be the Crown's argument in trying to prove that charge.
Correct.
He's still guilty of it, even if Wright's intentions were entirely legitimate.
That's correct. Although I don't believe the evidence will show that. That basically is the task,
the prosecution's
task
argument.
for the Crown.
I only have a minute. Do you think that there is any chance that Donald Bain will decide that the key to this will be Stephen Harper, that he needs to get him in front of the court?
I can't read the mind of Donald Bain, obviously. He's got his own strategic considerations. But, I think calling Stephen Harper runs a risk of having the trial blow out of proportion. I don't see in what we've heard today any need for that. But then, wait, let's see.
I don't think it's going to happen.
No, not even to describe other parts of the conversations that we've heard about today.
No,
It's not
because
useful.
even though it's true by Nigel Wright, if he's describing a conversation that he had with Stephen Harper, any reference to what Stephen Harper said is classically at law hearsay, but it can still be used to show why Nigel Wright did the things that he did.
Correct.
Right.
So
Okay.
I think that'll be enough.
Okay, that was very helpful. Thank you both. Jason Gilbert, Rob Walsh. Will you come back tomorrow? I'm going to book you right here, because I'm going to
pleasure.
need you tomorrow as well. Thank you both.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it very much.